I didn't think I was chasing anything. I thought I was done. I didn't tell anyone I was moving to Mexico because I didn't want opinions. I didn't want warnings or jokes or that look people get when they think you're making a mistake but don't know how to say it politely. I just handled things quietly. Closed accounts. Sold what I didn't need. Packed what fit. I wasn't running. That's the part that matters. My life back home hadn't fallen apart. It had just narrowed. Work, grocery store, the same stretch of road every day. Friends I talked to once every few months, mostly to confirm we were all still alive. Nothing tragic, nothing urgent, just finished. Mexico showed up as a solution, not a dream. I'd read enough to know it was cheaper, slower, forgiving if you kept your expectations reasonable. I didn't care about beaches or nightlife. I wanted a place where my money would last, and my days wouldn't feel like something I was waiting to escape. I chose a city inland. No expat scene to speak of. No one selling paradise. Just apartments, cafes, pharmacies, buses that ran when they felt like it. The first apartment wasn't special, but it worked. One bedroom, tile floors, a balcony that looked down onto a street that stayed busy without being loud. Rent was less than half of what I'd paid in the States, and that alone felt like I'd made a smart decision. That's how it started. With relief. I set up a routine fast. Not because I needed one, but because routine made everything feel real. Morning coffee at the same cafe. A walk after. Errands in the afternoon. Dinner at home most nights. I didn't feel lonely. I felt unobserved. That cafe mattered more than I realized at the time. It wasn't trendy. Just a place that opened early and didn't rush you out. I sat at the same table every morning, close enough to the window to watch people pass without feeling like part of the street. She worked nearby. Not at the cafe, close enough that we crossed paths often. At first, it was just recognition. Then a nod. Then conversation that didn't feel like an introduction because it didn't happen all at once. That's how familiarity works when you're older. It doesn't arrive as excitement. It arrives as absence of effort. She was younger than me, but not in a way that made me self-conscious. She worked long hours, complained about money the way people do when they're not asking, just stating facts, nothing flirtatious, nothing dramatic. I didn't think of her as a possibility. That's important. I wasn't looking for someone. I wasn't lonely in the way people imagine. I was settled. And when you feel settled, you stop scanning for danger. We talked because it was easy. About work, about prices going up, about how long everything took to get done. She laughed at things that weren't jokes. I liked that. The first time I helped her, it didn't feel like help. She was running late, the bus didn't show, and I had a car. That was it, no story, no meaning. Then, it was lunch one day because she hadn't eaten. Then, a small expense she mentioned casually, not directly. I covered it because it was easier than watching her do the math out loud. She accepted help without ceremony. No gratitude performance, no promises. That felt honest to me. I liked being useful again. That's something people don't warn you about. How usefulness disappears after retirement. No one needs you at a certain hour. No one waits for your decision. You become optional in a way that's quiet but constant. Mexico gave usefulness back to me in pieces. And because it didn't arrive all at once, I didn't treat it like something that needed boundaries. Everything still felt optional. I still paid my rent. I still controlled my accounts. I still made my own plans. Nothing had merged. Nothing had blurred far enough to worry about. Friends back home asked how it was going. I told them it was good, calm, cheap, easy. All true. What I didn't say, because I hadn't noticed it yet, was how quickly my days began orienting themselves around someone else's needs without me ever calling it commitment. She didn't ask for that. I supplied it. That distinction matters later. At this stage, I felt smart. I felt like I'd avoided the traps everyone warned about. No bar scenes, no romance fantasy, no rushing. Just two people whose lives happened to overlap. I told myself this was what doing it right looked like. Looking back now, I can see the first mistake clearly. I equated calm with safety. Nothing bad was happening, so I assumed nothing bad could. That assumption made everything that followed feel reasonable. When she mentioned problems, I listened without feeling obligated. When I helped, it felt like a choice. When I paid for something, it felt temporary. I never once thought, this is how it starts, because nothing was starting. Things were just continuing. That's the dangerous part. I remember one morning standing at the cafe window, coffee cooling in front of me, watching the street come alive, thinking I had finally figured out how to make the rest of my life manageable. Not exciting, not romantic, just sustainable. That word, sustainable, mattered to me more than happiness. I had enough money. Not a fortune, but enough if I didn't do anything stupid. Enough if I respected the math. Enough if I stayed calm. And I was calm. I didn't see that calm was the thing lowering my guard. Because when nothing feels urgent, you stop checking where things lead. You stop asking who holds what. You stop insisting on clarity because clarity feels unnecessary when everything looks fine. She wasn't part of my life yet, she was part of my routine, and at the time, that felt harmless. It felt like the best version of connection, one that didn't demand anything, didn't threaten my independence, didn't ask me to change. I believed I had landed somewhere neutral, a place where the future wouldn't require decisions, just maintenance. What I didn't understand yet was that maintenance, done long enough without inspection, becomes surrender. But at the beginning, standing there with my coffee, watching a city that didn't know my history move forward without me, all I felt was relief. And relief can be more blinding than hope, because it convinces you the hard part is already over. It still felt optional, right up until it wasn't. Nothing changed all at once. That's the only reason I didn't notice it happening. The days kept their shape. Coffee in the morning, a walk, errands, evenings that came quietly and left quietly. If you looked at my calendar, there was nothing dramatic to point to, no dates circled in red, no moment where I could say, this is when it shifted. But slowly, my attention started bending. At first, it was small adjustments. Timing my errands so I could give her a ride afterward. Staying a little longer at the cafe because I knew she'd pass by. Holding off on plans because she might need something later. I didn't think of that as sacrifice. I thought of it as consideration. She talked about her life the way people do when they're not asking for solutions, just relief. Work was unstable. Family expenses never lined up. Something always came up that ate whatever little margin she'd managed to build. I listened, and sometimes I stepped in. I told myself I was still choosing. That mattered to me. I wasn't being pressured. I wasn't being asked. I was helping because I wanted to. Help feels good when it's still optional. I covered a bill once because it was easier than watching her stress over it. Another time because she'd helped me with something small and it felt balanced. The amounts stayed modest. Always explainable. Always framed as temporary. She accepted help the same way she accepted everything else, without ceremony. No tears, no promises. Just a quiet nod and a thank you that didn't linger. That restraint made me trust her more. I've realized since then how easily restraint gets mistaken for integrity. How quickly we assume that because someone isn't demanding, they're careful. Because they don't push, they won't take. But restraint can also be a form of patience. Other foreigners I'd met in passing talked about boundaries like they were obvious things you either had or didn't. They shared stories, exaggerated, dramatic, about men who lost everything because they rushed, or ignored red flags, or chased attention. I listened politely, and then I dismissed it. Those stories had heat. Mine had none. What I was doing felt measured, calm, reasonable. It fit neatly inside the picture I had of myself as someone who'd learned from past mistakes. The truth was, I was making one mistake very carefully. As time passed, the help stopped being isolated moments and started forming a pattern. Not a big one, just enough to be predictable. If something went wrong, she looked to me before she looked anywhere else. Not with expectation, with habit. That distinction mattered to me then. I told myself that habit wasn't obligation, that I could stop any time. But I didn't test that theory. I liked that she relied on me in ways that didn't feel heavy. It made me feel anchored without being trapped, useful without being responsible, or so I thought. The first real shift happened around paperwork. She needed help with something official, a form, a fee, an appointment that required better Spanish than I had. She mentioned a relative who helped people navigate these things, someone who knew the system, someone she trusted. It made sense to let him handle it. I didn't see it as handing anything over, just outsourcing a task I wasn't equipped for. That's how it starts. The process went smoothly enough. A delay here, a clarification there, nothing alarming. I paid what was required, or what I was told was required. Money started moving in ways that felt procedural instead of personal. I told myself that was safer. It's easier to let go of vigilance when money stops feeling emotional and starts feeling administrative. Fees don't trigger alarms the way requests do. More paperwork followed, more help required, more reasons to rely on someone who spoke the language better, knew the offices, understood which rules were flexible and which weren't. I noticed that decisions were being made before I fully understood them. But I also noticed that things kept moving forward, and I didn't want to slow them down by insisting on explanations I might not even understand. That's where comfort becomes dangerous. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be the foreigner who questioned everything. I wanted to adapt, to trust the flow. Each time I deferred, I told myself it was temporary. I still believed I was in control because nothing irreversible had happened yet. No single step felt large enough to worry about. No single document felt final. But control doesn't disappear all at once. It thins. At some point, I can't tell you exactly when, my role changed. I stopped being the person deciding what to help with and became the person expected to smooth things out. If there was a problem, it landed in my lap. If there was a gap, I filled it. Not because anyone asked directly, but because I'd already done it before. Repetition builds expectation faster than conversation ever could. I remember the first time I hesitated. A small thing. A request that came at a bad moment. I thought about saying no. Not permanently, just this once. I felt the pause. And then I ignored it. Saying yes was easier than explaining why I couldn't. Easier than dealing with disappointment, even mild disappointment. Easier than breaking the rhythm we'd built. That's when help stopped being optional, even though I still believed it was. The first decision that couldn't be undone didn't announce itself as such. It felt like an efficiency upgrade, a way to simplify access, to reduce friction, to make future problems easier to solve. I remember thinking, this will actually make things safer. That thought still bothers me, because safety, I've learned, isn't about how smoothly things run. It's about whether you can stop them if you need to. That night, I felt closer than ever. Not emotionally, but structurally, like something had locked into place, like we were finally operating on the same side of the same system. I slept well. I didn't know then that the frame had shifted, that decisions were now happening in spaces I wasn't standing in. That access had been rerouted through people I trusted because someone else trusted them. Trust, stacked on trust, feels solid. Until you realize none of it rests on you. I still told myself I could leave anytime, that I wasn't trapped, that I was choosing this because it felt right. But choice, once filtered through habit and convenience and the desire not to disrupt calm, starts to look a lot like momentum. And momentum doesn't ask permission before it carries you somewhere you didn't plan to go. By the end of that period, months, not years, I felt deeply connected without ever feeling like I'd agreed to anything binding. That contradiction didn't bother me then. It felt like proof that I was doing things the right way, slowly, carefully, without drama. What I couldn't see yet was that drama isn't what destroys stability, silence does. The silence where questions don't get asked. The silence where explanations replace proof. The silence where you assume that because things are calm, they must also be safe. By the time I realized how much had shifted, I was already inside a structure I didn't build and didn't fully understand. And the closer I felt to everyone involved, the harder it became to admit that I no longer knew where I stood. The problem wasn't what I felt, it was what I no longer held. The person who changed everything didn't arrive like a threat. He arrived like a solution. There was a problem that needed handling, something official, something I didn't fully understand. A form that required better Spanish, a process that didn't move unless you knew where to stand and who to talk to. She mentioned a relative who helped people with these things, someone who knew how the system worked. I remember feeling relieved. That should have told me something, but at the time, it just felt practical. I wasn't proud of my limitations, but I was aware of them. This seemed like adapting, not surrendering. He explained things calmly, not rushed, not defensive. He spoke the language well, knew the offices, knew which delays mattered and which didn't. He told me what things cost and why they cost that much. He answered questions before I finished asking them. And she trusted him. That mattered more to me than anything else. From that point on, information started routing through him. Translation first. Then, logistics. Then, decisions that no longer felt like decisions, just steps in a process already underway. I told myself this was how things worked here, that insisting on full understanding would slow everything down. That trust meant letting go of control in small, reasonable ways. Money started moving for administrative reasons, fees, adjustments, requirements. Nothing dramatic. Each transfer came with an explanation that made sense on its own. Urgency was always justified. Delays were always temporary. I noticed small inconsistencies, dates that shifted, numbers that didn't quite match the last conversation, but nothing big enough to stop the machine. Nothing that couldn't be explained by translation gaps or cultural differences or my own unfamiliarity. And that was true. I was unfamiliar. That became my favorite explanation. The problem with unfamiliarity is that it can excuse almost anything if you lean on it long enough. There was no single moment where I felt tricked. No conversation where alarms went off. What I felt instead was momentum. Things were moving, and I didn't want to be the one who made them stop. Stopping would have required confrontation, or at least discomfort. I'd spent my whole life avoiding unnecessary discomfort. I was good at that. The first time I realized something was off wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I asked casually about a document I assumed included me. Not because I was worried, because I was curious. I wanted to see how things were progressing. He told me it wasn't finalized yet. That answer landed softly, soft enough to accept, soft enough to forget by the time I got home. Looking back, that was the moment the structure fully shifted. Up until then, my confidence came from feeling included, from being part of the process, even if I didn't understand every detail. After that, my confidence came from momentum alone. Things were already in motion, money had already moved. Plans had already been discussed without me present. Questioning them now would feel disruptive, maybe even suspicious. I didn't want to be suspicious. Suspicion felt rude, it felt paranoid, so I waited. The real crack didn't appear as a loss. It appeared as a boundary. A bank conversation that ended early, a question I wasn't authorized to ask, a polite explanation that I wasn't listed on something I'd assumed was shared. I remember standing there, nodding, pretending I understood, while something heavy settled in my chest. This wasn't about money yet. It was about access. I realized that everything important now passed through someone else. Information, decisions, movement. I was adjacent to my own life, not standing inside it. When I brought it up, carefully, calmly, the answers didn't sharpen, they softened. More reassurances, more explanations, more reasons not to worry yet. Waiting became the default. That's when I understood something I wish I'd learned earlier. Waiting is not neutral. It favors whoever already has control. The longer I waited, the more settled the structure became. The harder it would be to unwind anything without consequences I wasn't prepared for. But I still didn't feel angry, or betrayed, or panicked. What I felt was embarrassed. Embarrassed that I'd let things get this far without insisting on clarity. Embarrassed that I'd confused trust with delegation. Embarrassed that I'd believed good intentions could substitute for access. I replayed decisions in my head, tracing how each one had felt reasonable at the time. How nothing stood out as a mistake. How each step had been justified by calm, by consistency, by the desire not to disrupt what seemed to be working. I wasn't scammed in a single moment. I was outpaced. The structure had formed slowly, carefully, in ways that didn't trigger fear. And once it existed, it didn't need me anymore. That's the part people don't talk about. How control doesn't have to be taken from you. It can simply grow somewhere else while you're not looking. I tried, briefly, to reinsert myself, asked for updates, requested copies, wanted to understand the full picture. The responses were polite, but incomplete. Always something missing. Always something coming later. I could feel my position weakening with every unanswered question. And still, nothing exploded. The relationship didn't end. It changed temperature. Conversations lost depth. Plans became vague. People became harder to reach. That's when it hit me. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being left behind. Everything important had already moved past the point where my involvement was necessary. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, sharp, cold clarity. I had trusted emotionally early and structurally too soon. I'd given away the skeleton of my life because the surface felt calm. Trust without access, I learned, isn't trust. It's hope. And hope embedded into systems you don't control stops being an emotion. It becomes a liability. I went home that night and sat at the same small table where I drank my morning coffee. The apartment looked the same. The streets sounded the same. The city hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't confused anymore. I was excluded. That's the moment the wrong person reveals themselves. Not through cruelty or confrontation, but by showing you, quietly and unmistakably, that you no longer matter to the outcome. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, because I was doing math, not with numbers, but with choices, seeing how each one had seemed harmless, how carefully I'd avoided conflict, how much control I'd handed over without realizing it was something I should be holding on to. By the time I understood the shape of the mistake, the structure was already strong enough to stand without me, and no matter how calm things had felt at the beginning, I could see now that calm had never been the same thing as safe. Nothing broke. It just stopped holding me. If you were watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything end. That's the strange part. There was no argument, no final conversation where everything came into focus. No slammed door, no raised voices, no moment where someone finally admitted what was happening. Things just thinned. Messages came less often. Replies took longer. Plans softened until they dissolved without ever being canceled. When I reached out to the people who had been handling things, paperwork, accounts, logistics, I was met with politeness and distance. Always friendly, always busy, always later. At first, I treated it like a phase. Stress, timing, miscommunication. I told myself not to overreact, not to become the foreigner who panics the moment things don't move on his schedule. That instinct, to be patient, to be flexible, had served me well in Mexico. I was proud of it. I wasn't demanding. I wasn't loud. I adapted. Now, that same instinct worked against me. The more time passed, the less there was to confront. Nothing had gone wrong loudly enough to challenge. Everything was just delayed, postponed, softened. And delays have a way of becoming permanent if you don't interrupt them. I remember the day I finally tried to get clarity, not angrily, not forcefully, just firmly. I wanted to understand what I still had access to, what was shared, what wasn't. The answers didn't collapse. They narrowed. Explanations lost detail. Timelines stopped being specific. Responsibility shifted sideways. Not denied, just never fully acknowledged. That's when I felt it for the first time, not betrayal, but weightlessness. The realization that I wasn't standing on anything solid anymore. When I started asking questions to officials, banks, offices, people whose job it was to explain things, the tone changed. Not hostile, just formal, clear in a way that left no room for negotiation. Foreign ownership limits. Contractual realities. What signatures mean when they're missing? What assumptions mean when they aren't written down? They weren't unkind. They weren't surprised. They explain things the way you explain gravity to someone who's already fallen. There was no injustice sharp enough to argue with. No one had broken the rules. The rules had simply never been what I thought they were. That's when it became clear that my money wasn't gone in the way people imagine loss. It hadn't been stolen. It hadn't been taken overnight. It was simply no longer reachable. Funds tied up in structures I didn't control. Accounts I couldn't access. Assets that existed on paper but didn't belong to me in practice. I kept waiting for anger to arrive. It didn't. Anger needs a target. This didn't have one. What arrived instead was shame. Not the public kind, no one was pointing or laughing, but the internal kind. The quiet recalibration of how you see yourself. The realization that you weren't unlucky. You were careless in slow motion. I stopped telling people what was happening. Every explanation sounded like an excuse, even to me. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want advice. I wanted to understand how I'd let something so important erode without noticing. The relationship didn't end in any dramatic sense. It faded. She didn't disappear. She remained just present enough to avoid confrontation, just distant enough to avoid responsibility. Conversations became polite, shallow, functional. That hurt less than I expected. By the time I admitted what was happening, I was already past heartbreak. What I felt was displacement, like discovering the floor plan you memorized no longer matches the building you're standing in. The third party vanished more cleanly. Calls unanswered, messages unread. Eventually, silence. Still, nothing exploded. The cafe still opened every morning. The trash truck still passed by with its recorded voice. The street below my balcony still rearranged itself the same way it always had. Routine stayed intact at the surface level, which somehow made the loss harder to process. It felt unreal, like a life continuing after the foundation had been quietly removed. I started making plans the way you do when you're afraid to name them. What if I needed to leave quickly? What if I couldn't maintain the apartment? How long could my remaining funds stretch if I stopped pretending this would reverse itself? It was during one of those mental exercises that the truth finally landed. Retirement was no longer possible. Not there, not as I'd planned it. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with a dull pressure, like weather moving in. I understood that even if I stayed, I'd be staying inside a reduced version of the life I'd built, one without the margin I'd depended on. And margin, I'd learned, is what keeps calm from turning into risk. I wasn't angry at Mexico. That's important. The systems worked exactly the way they were designed to work. They hadn't changed. I had simply stepped into them without understanding where the weight was carried. I wasn't angry at her either. Not in the way people expect. I could see the pressures she lived under. Family expectations that didn't pause for romance. Economic realities that punished hesitation. A system that rewarded proximity to resources. None of that excused what happened. But it explained it. What I felt most clearly was responsibility. Not moral responsibility, but practical responsibility. I had exposed myself. I had handed over structure without earning certainty. I started telling myself I'd return to the US. Temporarily, just to regroup, just to stabilize. That word, stabilize, had crept back into my vocabulary, and I hated what it implied. Packing was strange. I didn't have much, but every object felt heavier than it should have. Not because of memory, but because of intention. Each item represented a future I quietly assumed would happen. I hadn't lost love first. I'd lost stability. Love, in this story, had always been secondary, optional, something that could fade without collapsing the whole structure. Stability couldn't. I didn't leave immediately. I lingered. Not because I thought things would fix themselves, but because I needed time to accept what had already happened. Leaving felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud, that the careful version of myself I'd trusted had failed. The shame stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because I'd been fooled, but because I'd been comfortable enough to stop paying attention. Collapse, when it comes without drama, doesn't feel like falling. It feels like standing still while the ground quietly lowers itself beneath you. By the time I finally locked the door and stood in the hallway one last time, listening to sounds I'd once taken as proof that everything was fine, there was no argument left to have. The story had already ended. It just hadn't denounced itself. I didn't feel defeated. I felt smaller. And I understood, finally, that the most dangerous losses aren't the ones that arrive with noise and conflict. They're the ones that happen so quietly you don't realize what's gone until you try to stand on it again. It wasn't Mexico that failed me. It was the story I told myself. Back in the United States, everything felt sharper than I remembered. The noise, the pace, the way people talked like time was something they were constantly losing. I stayed with my sister at first, sleeping in a spare room that smelled faintly of detergent and boxes. She didn't ask many questions. That was a kindness I didn't know how to thank her for. When people asked how Mexico was, I said it was nice. When they asked why I was back, I said I needed to take care of some things. Both were true. Neither explained anything. I found work again because the numbers didn't leave me a choice. Nothing dramatic, nothing connected to who I'd been before, just something that paid hourly and didn't ask many questions. The body remembers how to do that kind of work. The joints remember too. Each morning, I woke up earlier than I needed to. Old habits. I drank bad coffee standing at the counter, not because I liked it that way, but because sitting still felt indulgent now. Somewhere along the line, rest had started to feel undeserved. That surprised me. What surprised me more was what I replayed in my head. Not arguments, not conversations, not moments where someone said something cruel. I replayed decisions, small ones, quiet ones, the kind you don't think to write down. The day I didn't ask to see paperwork because it felt awkward. The time I accepted an explanation instead of asking for proof. The moment I told myself it would be rude to slow things down. I saw how often I'd chosen ease over clarity. Loneliness didn't feel like loneliness at the time, it felt like usefulness. Like being the person who could help, who could smooth things out, who could make problems smaller just by showing up. That felt good. That felt earned. What I didn't recognize was how quickly usefulness can become identity when the rest of your roles fall away. I hadn't moved to Mexico looking for love. That's an easy story to tell, and it lets you keep your dignity intact. The truth was less flattering. I moved because I didn't know who I was once I wasn't needed anymore. Mexico gave me a version of that feeling back. Quietly, gradually, and I grabbed onto it without checking what it was attached to. When I thought about her, I tried to stay honest. She wasn't evil. She wasn't scheming in the way people imagine when they hear these stories. She lived inside pressures I never had to fully carry, family obligations that didn't pause, financial realities that punished hesitation, a system that rewarded proximity to resources and didn't care much about intent. She made choices that made sense from where she stood. So did I. The difference was that she understood the structure she was operating in. I didn't. That's the part that still stings. Not that I trusted someone, but that I trusted without understanding. For a while, I wanted a clean lesson. Something I could reduce to advice. Something that would make the loss feel useful, transferable, almost instructional. But the truth resisted that. The truth was uncomfortable and quiet. Mexico didn't lie to me. It didn't trick me. It didn't promise anything. It didn't deliver. I stepped into systems shaped by history, law, and necessity, carrying assumptions built somewhere else. Those assumptions worked fine right up until they didn't. Fear wasn't what undid me. Comfort was. Comfort made me stop asking questions. Comfort made me accept explanations instead of evidence. Comfort convinced me that because everything felt calm, it must also be safe. I'd mistaken familiarity for protection. Trust, I learned too late, isn't something you feel, it's something you test. Slowly, repeatedly, with boundaries that don't dissolve just because things are going well. Emotion can come early, kindness can come early, help can come early, structure cannot. I don't regret going to Mexico. That surprises people when I say it, but it's true. When I think about those mornings, the café, the street waking up, the sense that my days finally belong to me, I don't feel bitterness. I feel clarity. Those moments were real. They just weren't the whole picture. I'd built a life that felt light because I never checked where the weight was being carried. Back home, people wanted conclusions. Would I do it again? Was it worth it? What should others avoid? I didn't have answers that fit neatly into advice. Any warning I offered sounded hollow, even to me. People don't listen when they think a story can't happen to them. I wouldn't have listened either. What I had instead was understanding, not of Mexico, but of myself. I understood how easily calm can replace attention, how consistency can masquerade as trust, how quickly you can give away control when nothing feels urgent enough to defend it. I understood how being needed can feel like belonging when you're no longer sure where you fit. And I understood that none of this absolved me. If anything, it made my responsibility clearer. I don't tell this story to scare people away from Mexico. That would be dishonest. Mexico wasn't the villain in my story. It was the setting. The real danger wasn't foreign. It was familiar. It was the part of me that wanted things to stay easy, the part that avoided discomfort, the part that believed good intentions could substitute for clear structure. Fear is usually taught through exaggeration, through stories where danger is loud, obvious, and easy to spot. What happened to me was none of that. It was ordinary, incremental, built out of reasonable choices that added up to exposure. If there's wisdom here, it isn't dramatic. It doesn't fit into a checklist or a headline. It's this: don't give trust a skeleton until it's proven it can stand on its own. Not because people are bad, but because systems don't care how you feel. I didn't lose everything in a moment. I lost it over time by letting comfort replace curiosity. That's not a failure of character, but it is a failure of attention. When I think about Mexico now, I don't think about loss first. I think about how easily I stopped paying attention once things felt settled. And I wonder how many stories we tell about places, about people, about danger are really stories about what happens when we mistake calm for safety. I don't regret the chapter. I regret the assumptions I carried into it. And if there's one thing I hold on to now, it's this quiet clarity. Trust isn't something you give to feel safe. It's something you build slowly enough that safety never has to be assumed.